Talking about Nehemiah again tonight. This is the same slide basically as what we had up to this morning. And basically what happened was this: as I was going through studying for this message this morning throughout the week, I kept being reminded over and over again. There was a lesson I preached on Nehemiah about 3 years ago, and I really thought that would be appropriate to bring this evening as well, because there's hardly any overlap between the two. This morning we talked about some lessons that we can gain from Nehemiah for us as a people, a community of God's believers. And yet there are many lessons that Nehemiah teaches us to apply individually. He is such a model of leadership, such a model of God's servant, a man who would stand up against so much opposition. Just individually, we could talk about a whole lot for Nehemiah as a group of people, or as with tonight, for just what Nehemiah teaches us about how we can stand before God individually. I've often been struck by just how often God's servant is asked to stand alone, called to stand alone. And you could probably just rattle off a whole list of names. I mean, Elijah, Daniel, Esther, Moses, what we're talking about tonight, Nehemiah, Job. There are so many. You go on and on and on. And so many times God's servant is called to stand alone. And that's not to diminish in any way what we find in the church. The church is the design of God. We find strength together here in the church. We are led by a group of men, not just one man in particular leads the church. There's so much for us here that I don't want to diminish. And yet, there are so many times when God's will, God's purpose hinges on the singular resolve of one man, as we find here in Nehemiah. I read this quote from Richard Ellsworth Day. I think it's very true. Listen to this and see if you don't agree with what he says here. He says, "It would be of no surprise if a study of secret causes were undertaken to find out that in every golden era in human history it proceeds ultimately from the devotion and righteous passion of one single individual. This does not set aside the sovereignty of God. It simply indicates the instrument through which God uniformly works. In many ways, there are really no bona fide mass movements. It may look that way, but at the center of the column there is always at least one person who knows his God and knows where God is going." Not really any bona fide mass movement, so to speak, but at the center of the column you'll usually find that one person who knows his God and knows where God is going. God is perfect. God's church is perfect. The design of God's church is perfect, regardless of what you and I may do. But thank God for those servants that really rise up above all opposition and stand alone. I think the church would still be here today if it were not for Alexander Campbell. I think the church would still be here today if it were not for Gus Nichols. And yet how many hundreds, how many thousands have come to Christ because of their efforts. And so we praise God for what He has done through His men and women that He has sent. And let's apply it to our own lives. How many things does God depend on you to get done in this world? How many co-workers can only you reach? How many neighbors can only you? How many family members? Is God counting on you? I need you. I put you in that position because I'm going to reach them through you. And so much of what God plans to do in this world hinges on whether or not one Christian will allow Him to do it. There was such a man in the mid-400s before Christ. He was the cupbearer to the king of Persia. Oh, it's very remarkable that Nehemiah has this position. Well, what this is, it's basically a taste tester. He stands between the king and poisoning. He has the very high responsibility of seeing to the safety and the security of the king, and he could very easily bring harm to the king if that's what he wanted to do. He is an outsider. He is a Jew. He's not a Persian, and yet he's found this trust in the eyes of the king that he has this exalted position in his court. It should tell us right up front a lot about the kind of obvious integrity that Nehemiah has. And so tonight I want to look with you just very broadly at Nehemiah the servant and several different aspects of ministry. What can Nehemiah teach us about ministry? We're all ministers. And so what can he teach us about our individual, personal ministry? Well, first of all, Nehemiah had a personal compassion for the people. He had a personal compassion for the people. We talked a little about this morning, but it's so good to repeat. You will find it most difficult, if not impossible, to lighten any load that you do not first feel in your own soul. We will feel it next to impossible to lighten any load that we do not first bear in our own soul. We cannot expect to alleviate any burden for which we have no compassion. And Nehemiah starts here. He has a compassion for the people. Let's look at where this text begins here, Nehemiah 1 and verse 3. And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who has survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. As soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days. And I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. He wept. He fasted for many, many days. This is the commencement of Nehemiah's ministry to his people. If you had walked out to that wall and you had seen Nehemiah hard at work, you might have commented, what engineering skills, what management skills, what political skills to have gotten all these resources, all these skills that he brings to bear. And yes, that is true. But for Nehemiah, it started with compassion. You have many skills this evening that God expects you to bring to bear to work with those skills in His kingdom, but it's got to start with a compassion for the people. But that can sound a whole lot easier than it is to do. Boy, it sounds so. Just love people. Just have compassion for people. That's not that hard, is it? There was a news story in the 1970s that dominated New York City. It centered around this one particular woman who was destitute. She had run out of food. She was in a very bad living situation. She had a 5-day-old baby. And she left her apartment to get something. Very quickly she intended to be back, and yet she did not take her baby with her. And she did not realize, it did not dawn on her that that baby was within reach of her pet dog. And in its rage of hunger, that dog ate that baby. And the whole city was in an uproar. We can't allow something like this to happen in our society. How can something like this happen right next door to where we live and where we work and where we go to school? And the whole city was in an uproar. At the press conference, one of the councilmen stood and he said this. He said, "Do you know what you're asking me to do? Do you know what I don't even have a heart big enough sometimes to hear every heartbeat within my own family. You're asking me to hear the heartbeat of an entire city in a borough of this size." And he quoted George Eliot. He said, "You may as well ask me to hear the sound of every blade of grass growing and the heartbeat of every squirrel. The noise would be deafening." Used to be the news, the amount of information that would come into our living rooms through our TVs, through our newspapers, it would just swarm all over us. It's too much. We can't disseminate it all, but at least it was out there. I mean, you at least could make yourself feel a little bit better by saying, well, there's not really much I can do about it. But now in today's age, well, the news is right next to us, isn't it? You open up Facebook. I wonder how many Facebook friends you have. They say the average number of Facebook friends is 338. That's a lot of friends. That's a lot of sicknesses. That's a lot of boo-boos. That's a lot of births. That's a lot of deaths. That's a lot of cancers. That's a lot of moves. That's a lot of... And you go on down the list, and there are so many things tugging at your heartstrings. I want to extend the compassion for it, but it's overwhelming me. I mean, just to personally message each one of your Facebook friends, for many of us, would take a year, maybe 2, 3, or 4 years for some of you. I want to have compassion for everybody that God has put in my circle, but it just overwhelms me. And what do we do about that? I would offer to you that we lean heavily upon the power of prayer in this regard. We sing a prayer kind of song. Lord, lay some soul upon my heart and love that soul through me. May I nobly do my part to win that soul for thee. I think that's how we have to approach it. Lord, put someone on my heart and help me to do my part. Whatever you put in front of me, and we do for one what we wish we could do for all of them. We wish that we could extend ourselves out and show God's love to every single person that we meet. And maybe that's the key. Whoever God brings me to meet, brings to my doorstep, whatever God puts in front of me to do, I'll do it. I'll do what I can. And when we do it that way, we model Christian service for other people who are watching. And when I do what I can do for one, what I wish I could do for all, I can't do it for all, and yet I'm modeling Christian service. And when a church acts that way, when a body of God's people acts that way, there's power, and we can really start to move mountains. But you have to develop a personal compassion. We can't carry everything, but you must carry something. You must burden your heart with something if you wish to carry anything for the Lord. First of all, Nehemiah had a personal compassion for his people. Second, how did he prioritize his mission? He prioritized in prayer. Nehemiah prioritized in prayer. 13 times in this book, you will read where Nehemiah hit his knees, and I prayed to the God of heaven, and I prayed to the God of heaven, and I prayed to the God of heaven. Nehemiah, I love how he's just all the time praying. You'll see where the king asked me a question, and I prayed to God, and then I answered. There is just a millisecond worth of a prayer, but Nehemiah is constantly praying to his God, and he prioritizes in prayer. John Chrysostom, writing in the 6th to 7th centuries A.D., he said this of prayer: "The potency of prayer hath subdued the strength of fire. It hath bridled the rage of lions, hushed anarchy to rest, extinguished wars, appeased the elements, expelled demons, burst the chains of death, expanded the gates of heaven, assuaged diseases, repelled frauds, rescued cities from destruction, stayed the sun in its course, arrested the progress of the thunderbolt. Prayer is an all-efficient panoply, a treasure undiminished, a mind which is never exhausted, a sky unobscured by the clouds, a heaven unruffled by the storm. It is the root, the fountain, and the mother of 1,000 blessings." Is that just rhetoric? Are those just pretty words, or do we believe that? Do we believe in the power of prayer? I'll tell you something about my own preferences. When it comes down to, does Jordan want to lead his own steps, or would I like God to lead my steps? I'll pick God. I want God to lead my steps. And so we order our steps in prayer, searching God out in His Word and praying all over it. God, what would you have me to do? I think if He created all this, He knows how it works by now. I think He can order our steps pretty well. What an unimaginable power that we brush up against in the advent of prayer. Thirdly, Nehemiah got proximate to the situation. He got close. You and I will never really get a sense of how it is until we get close. This is something I'm working on personally. Getting close to people and their questions. If you never get close, you'll always be proclaiming at a distance. And people got some tough questions out there. And we have to remember, we do pretty well at answering questions. I think we do anyway, at mining through the Scriptures and trying to find out what is truth and answering the questions, and we need to do that. We need to always be ready with a defense of what we believe. But I'm convinced that it is only when we get close that we will start to answer a questioner and not just a question. You understand the difference there? When we get close, we answer a questioner, not just a question. How useless is it to answer a question if we do not answer a questioner? There's oftentimes a difference. I can come up with a lot of answers to things that don't really get somebody where they're trying to go with the question. A lot of times there's a gap between the condition of the questioner and the truth, and it lays on us to help them get there. Sometimes from your perspective, you can see something that somebody else can't see. And it's not just enough to answer the question, you got to help them with the journey and answer the questioner. And Nehemiah got up close and personal to the situation. We got to get up close and personal to people if we want to start giving some real questions to questioners, not just lifeless questions. We have to remember that we're dealing with persons. Persons come with a convergence of a multitude of ideas and experiences and pains and hurts and joys. We're answering persons, not just lifeless questions. I like the story of Joseph Damien. Joseph Damien goes out to work with the, I think you would call them native Indians, of Molokai out in Hawaii. Molokai is a lepers colony. And he went out there to work with these people and to minister to them and to preach to them the gospel. Until finally one day, I believe he was cooking some water, something to that effect, and hot scalding water splashed out onto his foot, and he didn't feel it. And he realized that he had contracted the very disease of the people to whom he was ministering. And as his body deteriorated and as plans were made for that body after he passed from it, the country of Belgium was trying to take his body back to his home country. And the natives there of Molokai asked, please leave something. I know it sounds gruesome. Leave something. Leave his hand. That's what touched us. And so today when you visit Molokai, you will find the grave of Joseph Damien's hand because he touched them. He got close. And if you ever want to change anybody's life, if you ever want to really answer a questioner, you must get close. Nehemiah got close. He had a personal compassion. He prioritized in prayer. He got proximate to the situation. Fourthly, he had a process of preparation. He knew what it would take, and he got prepared for it. You know, we've discussed this particular problem in the church before, and it's a very dangerous trend. If it is a trend, it may just be the way things are. But we send hundreds and hundreds and thousands of children into the halls of so-called learning completely unprepared for the experience. And when they get there, they get so hyped up on social causes and slogans and catchphrases. They get some really bizarre ideas because they're unprepared for what they're going to find there. And these free thought societies, they're so full packed of young people that really want to make a difference. They really want to do right in this world, but they were unprepared. And they fail to acknowledge the fact. So often they're making moral judgments. You know, a lot of these associations will say the church has got it all wrong. The world is wrong, and you're being too bigoted. You're being too against, too anti. And they make moral judgments on the church. When in reality, where did they get those moral judgments? Where do you get the power to say anything's wrong at all? Where do you get the ability to say anything's right or anything's wrong? And they come unprepared to deal with these ideas. As they leave the safety of this gathering, they must know that they're going to deal with hard questions, not simplistic questions with simplistic answers. It's so easy to boil it down and say, look, it's just easy. It's simplistic. It's not simplistic. And may we ever train our young people up to meet what they're really going to face when they get out there. Hard questions with answers you got to sit and think about for a while. They don't just come off the cuff. Nehemiah was prepared. We must be prepared. Finally, I would submit to you that we must press on with purpose. Nehemiah chapter 6 is possibly one of my favorite verses in the entire Bible, definitely in the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah chapter 6 and verse 3. Nehemiah has been working hard on this project, but he's been being called down over and over and over again by enemies without the gate and also enemies within the gate who have allegiances and alliances outside of God's people. Nehemiah wants you to come in the temple and be safe. Nehemiah, they want to talk to you out there. Nehemiah, we got a letter, and they're constantly trying to call him down. And Nehemiah chapter 6 and verse 3, he says this, "And I sent messengers to them saying, I'm doing a great work, and I cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and come down to you?" There's times in the midst of hardships and persecutions where we're going to have to say, I cannot come down. I'm doing a hard work, a good work, and I cannot come down. There's going to be times where you have to call to remembrance your purpose in the middle of temptations and sins. There's going to be times where you have to call to remembrance your purpose in the midst even of things that are good and wholesome. But when you get too many good and wholesome things and you neglect that which is best, it's still a problem. He said, I'm doing a good work and I can't come down. It's going to be different from season to season of your life. That good work is going to change, but it takes the resolve to say, I can't come down from this. And he pressed on with purpose. Christians live intentional lives. You look to Luke chapter 14, and Jesus said, "For which of you desiring to build a tower does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it. Otherwise, when he's laid a foundation and is not able to finish it, all who see it will begin to mock him, saying, "This man began to build and was not able to finish." If we would be effective servants to God, we must first decide, what are we going to do for God? What am I going to do for God? And then press on with purpose. I'm doing a good work, and I dare not come down. Tonight, it may be that you've been thinking of giving your life to God. It may be that you're not a Christian and that you've been thinking about it. I want to encourage you to come to Him tonight, but come in this way. That once I'm there, once I'm working in His kingdom, I cannot come down. I dare not come down, and press on with purpose. It's the best life you could ever live. Don't turn back from it. Don't put your hand to the plow and then look away. If you are a Christian this evening, yet you have looked away, you have not been pressing on with purpose, and you need to rededicate your commitment tonight, I encourage you to make that right. If you have any need for any prayer, encouragement or otherwise, please come while we stand and while we sing.